I pressed my face against the cool glass of my bedroom window, watching Ann Miller climb back through hers across the street. She moved with practiced silence, one leg over the sill, then the other, before disappearing into the darkness of her room. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:15 a.m. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her sneak out. Over the past few weeks, I'd caught glimpses of her slipping away into the night, always around the same time, always through that same window. I never said anything to anyone about it. What business was it of mine what Ann Miller did with her evenings? But tonight felt different. Tonight, I noticed the shadow in the Millers' living room window that hadn't been there before. Mr. Miller stood there, arms crossed, watching his daughters return just like I was. I pulled away from my window and climbed back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Something about the way Mr. Miller had been standing there, so still and deliberate, made my stomach feel tight. I knew that look from my own father when I'd pushed things too far. 20 minutes later, I heard Ann's window slide open again. I sat up and looked outside to see her climbing out for the second time tonight. She dropped onto the small roof over their front porch, then shimmied down the support post like she'd done it 100 times before. Mr. Miller's shadow was no longer in the living room window. Ann walked down the sidewalk with her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, her dark hair catching the light from the street lamps. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who thought the world belonged to her at 17. I watched until she turned the corner and vanished from sight. An hour passed, then another 30 minutes. I kept checking the clock, wondering when she'd come back, wondering if Mr. Miller was still awake, and waiting. At 3:15 a.m., Ann appeared at the end of our street again. She walked slower this time, her shoulders hunched against the September chill that had settled in while she was gone. I watched her approach her house, expecting to see her scale the porch post and slip back through her window like always. Instead, she stopped at the front door and tried the handle. It didn't turn. She stepped back, looked up at her bedroom window, then walked around the side of the house. I could see her moving in the shadows, testing what I assumed were other doors and windows. She came back to the front porch a few minutes later, and even from across the street I could see the change in her posture. Her shoulders sagged. She sat down heavily on the front steps. She was locked out. I lay in bed for another 10 minutes watching her sit there on those steps. She'd pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Every few minutes, she'd get up and try the front door again or walk around to check the back. But she always returned to the same spot on the porch steps. My parents had always taught me to help people when they needed it. The right thing to do was obvious. I slipped out of my room and down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step that always woke my mom. The front door key was hanging on its hook by the kitchen window. I unlocked the deadbolt as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The night air was cooler than it had looked through my window. Ann didn't notice me crossing the street until I was already standing at the edge of her front yard. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low. She looked up, startled. "Daniel, what are you doing out here? I saw you from my window. Are you okay?" Ann glanced at her front door, then back at me. Even in the dim light from the street lamp, I could see the embarrassment on her face. "I'm fine. Just locked out. You can crash on our couch if you want. My parents won't mind." She shook her head quickly. "No, thanks. I'll be fine. They'll let me in eventually." "You sure? It's pretty cold out here." "I'm sure." She pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "Thanks, though. Really." I stood there for another minute, wanting to say more, but not knowing what. Ann had always been polite to me when we passed each other on the street or in the school hallways, but we didn't really know each other. She was 3 years older, ran with a different crowd, lived in a different world than mine. "Okay," I said finally. "But if you change your mind, just knock. I'll leave the front door unlocked. You don't have to do that. It's no big deal." Anne smiled at me then, the first real smile I'd seen from her all night. "You're sweet, Daniel. But I'll be fine. Go back to bed." I walked back across the street, but I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I sat on my own front steps for a while, watching Anne across the way. She'd pulled her phone out of her pocket and was staring at it, probably thinking about calling someone. But who would she call at 3:30 in the morning? And what would she say? Eventually, the cold drove me back inside. I locked the front door but left the chain off, just in case Anne changed her mind. Back in my room, I positioned myself at the window where I could still see her. She hadn't moved from the porch steps. If anything, she looked smaller now, more alone. I must have dozed off for a few minutes because when I looked again, the clock read 3:47 a.m. Anne was still on the porch, but now she was slumped against the front door. Her eyes were closed. She'd fallen asleep sitting up. That's when I saw the man. He came from the side yard, moving in a crouch along the edge of the house. Even from across the street, I could tell he didn't belong there. His movements were too careful, too deliberate. He wasn't stumbling home from a late night out or walking a dog. He was hunting. Anne's eyes opened just as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. I saw her mouth open, probably to scream, but his hand was over it before any sound came out. She struggled, her arms flailing, her legs kicking at him, but he was too strong. He dragged her off the porch and around the side of the house, toward the backyard. I was already moving before I realized what I was doing. My feet hit the floor, and I was running for the stairs. But something made me stop at my bedroom doorway. Some voice in my head that sounded like my father, telling me to think before I acted, to be smart about this. By the time I reached my window again, they were both gone. The front porch was empty. The street was quiet. If I hadn't seen it happen, I would have thought Anne had just gone inside. But I had seen it, and now I didn't know what to do. I stood at that window for the next 20 minutes, watching the Miller house, waiting for some sign of what was happening behind it, waiting for lights to come on, for Mr. Miller to wake up, for something to tell me this wasn't really happening. The man appeared again at 4:07 a.m. He came from the backyard, walking casually now, his hands in his pockets like he was out for an evening stroll. He didn't run. He didn't look around nervously. He just walked down the sidewalk and disappeared around the same corner Anne had turned earlier that night. Anne never came back to the front porch. I stayed at my window until the sky started to turn gray, watching that empty porch, telling myself that maybe I'd been wrong, maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, maybe Anne had managed to get inside somehow and was safe in her bed. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I'd watched Anne Miller die and I hadn't done anything to stop it. I watched that empty porch until my eyes burned from the strain. The street stayed quiet, save for the occasional car passing through on their way to early morning shifts. I kept expecting Anne to appear around the corner, to prove that what I'd seen was just some twisted nightmare my tired brain had conjured up. At 6:15 a.m., the Millers' front door opened. Mr. Miller stepped outside in his bathrobe and slippers, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who'd been awake all night, waiting. He looked around the front yard, then walked down the porch steps and headed toward the side of the house where I'd last seen the man drag Anne. His scream cut through the morning air like a knife. It was a sound I'd never heard a grown man make before, raw and broken and animal, the kind of noise that came from somewhere deeper than lungs or throat. Within seconds, Lights started flicking on in houses up and down our street. My mother's feet hit the floor in her bedroom, and I heard her moving quickly down the hall. Mr. Miller kept screaming Anne's name over and over until his voice cracked and failed. I pressed myself closer to the window, trying to see around the corner of their house, but the angle was wrong. All I could see was Mr. Miller on his knees in the side yard, his hands covering his face. Mom burst into my room without knocking. "Daniel, get away from that window." "Mom, something happened to Anne." "I said get away." She grabbed my arm and pulled me back from the glass. "Go to your room and stay there." "This is my room." "Then stay in it. Don't look outside. Don't go anywhere." Her voice had that sharp edge that meant arguing would only make things worse. But I couldn't stop myself from moving back to the window the moment she left. Mrs. Miller had come outside now, wearing a nightgown and no shoes. She was running toward the side yard, where her husband knelt, and when she saw what he'd found, she made a sound that was somehow worse than his screaming. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from her entire body. The first police car arrived 3 minutes later, its red and blue lights painting the dawn in harsh, alternating colors. Then another car, and another. Within 10 minutes, our quiet street looked like a crime scene from television, complete with yellow tape and officers directing traffic away from the area. I watched them work from my bedroom window, my stomach twisting with each new development. 2 paramedics wheeled a gurney around to the Millers' backyard, but when they brought it back out 20 minutes later, the shape under the white sheet was too small, too still. Anne Miller, who'd been sitting on those front steps just 2 hours ago, was being loaded into an ambulance that would never need to use its sirens. The detective who took charge was a woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much. She directed the other officers with quiet efficiency, pointing toward different areas of the yard, sending people to knock on doors. One officer started taking photographs of everything: the front porch, the side yard, the flower beds where someone had clearly walked through during the night. Mr. Miller sat in the back of a police car with the door open, his head in his hands. Every few minutes, an officer would approach him with questions, and I could see him shaking his head, gesturing helplessly with his hands. Mrs. Miller had been taken inside by a female officer who kept one arm around her shoulders. The knock on our front door came at 7:30 a.m. I heard Mom talking to someone in the living room, her voice carefully controlled. When she came back upstairs, she looked pale and shaken. "They want to talk to us," she said. "Both of us. About whether we saw or heard anything last night." My mouth went dry. "What did you tell them?" "That we were asleep. That we didn't see anything." She studied my face with the kind of intensity that meant she was looking for lies. "Daniel, did you see anything? Hear anything? Were you even awake?" I opened my mouth to tell her everything. About watching Anne sneak out and return. About seeing her locked out on the porch. About the man who'd grabbed her and dragged her away while I stood frozen at my window, too scared to help. Instead, I shook my head. I was asleep. The lie felt like swallowing glass, but once it was out, I couldn't take it back. Mom nodded and smoothed down my hair in that automatic way mothers do when they're trying to comfort themselves as much as their children. "Good," she said. "We don't know anything, and we're not going to get involved in this mess. These people need to grieve in peace." The detective interviewed us 20 minutes later in our living room. She was professional but persistent, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch inconsistencies in our answers. Had we heard any unusual sounds, seen any strangers in the neighborhood? Noticed any changes in the Miller family's routine? Mom answered with the same calm denials, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she smoothed her robe over her knees. When the detective turned to me, I felt like she could see straight through to the truth. "Daniel, your bedroom window faces the street, doesn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did you look outside at all last night? Sometimes kids hear a noise and peek out to see what's happening." "No, ma'am. I was asleep." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded and made a note in her small pad. "Well, if you remember anything later, anything at all, you call us, okay? Sometimes details come back to people after the shock wears off." They interviewed every family on our block that day. I watched from my window as officers went door to door, spending longer at some houses than others. Mrs. Chen talked to them for almost an hour, gesturing frequently toward the Miller house. The Martinez family brought out coffee for the officers. Everyone wanted to help, wanted to contribute something useful to finding whoever had done this. But apparently no one had seen or heard anything. Not Mrs. Chen, who sometimes stayed up late watching old movies. Not Mr. Rodriguez, who left for work at 4 a.m. every morning. Not the Pratt family, whose teenage son was known for sneaking out on weekends. The entire neighborhood had somehow slept through Ann Miller's murder. Except for me. By the afternoon, word had spread that Mr. Miller was being questioned more intensively. I heard Mom on the phone with Mrs. Davis from 2 streets over, talking in hushed tones about how the police always looked at family members first, how terrible it must be for him to lose his daughter and then be treated like a suspect. "He locked her out," Mom said quietly into the phone. "Can you imagine living with that, knowing that if you just opened the door?" But by evening, the police cars were gone from the Miller's driveway. Mom told me later that Mrs. Miller had verified her husband's whereabouts throughout the night. They'd been awake together, arguing about what to do about Ann's behavior, how to handle her latest episode of sneaking out. The irony was bitter and sharp. The very fight that had led to Ann being locked outside had also provided her father with an alibi for her murder. The investigation shifted to the physical evidence. Officers had found signs of a struggle in the backyard, disturbed soil where someone had been dragged, footprints that didn't match any of the family members. More disturbing, they discovered evidence that someone had been watching the house for several days. Cigarette butts behind the garden shed, flattened areas in the bushes where someone had been crouching for extended periods. Ann Miller had been stalked, studied, and finally murdered by someone who'd learned her patterns and waited for the perfect opportunity. The fact that she'd been locked out had just made his job easier. Within a week, every house on our street had new deadbolt locks. The Pratt family installed motion sensor lights that flooded their entire front yard with white light whenever a cat walked past. Mrs. Chen bought a security system that was so sensitive it went off when the wind blew her porch chimes too hard. Mr. Rodriguez started carrying a baseball bat when he walked to his truck in the early morning darkness. Mom became a different person overnight. She drove me to school every morning instead of letting me walk the 6 blocks like I had since 5th grade. She picked me up every afternoon, waiting in the car line with the elementary school parents, even though I was perfectly capable of getting home on my own. When I asked if I could go to James's house after school, she said no. When I wanted to ride my bike to the convenience store for comic books, she said, "Absolutely not. Not until they catch whoever did this," she said, and something in her voice told me that she didn't believe they ever would. She made me promise not to talk to other kids about what had happened, not to repeat anything I might have overheard from the police or the neighbors. "This family has been through enough," she said. "They don't need children spreading rumors or making up stories." But I wasn't making up stories. I was keeping the biggest story of all locked up inside me, where it sat like a stone in my chest, getting heavier every day. Each time I saw Mr. Miller come outside to get his mail, or Mrs. Miller drive past our house on her way to the grocery store, I wanted to run to them and tell them everything. I wanted to describe the man I'd seen, to give them some detail that might help the police find him. Instead, I sat at my bedroom window every night, staring at the Miller house, which already looked abandoned even though the family still lived there. The porch light stayed on all night now, casting harsh shadows across the steps where Anne had sat waiting to come home. Sometimes I imagined I could still see her there, knees pulled up to her chest, checking her phone and waiting for someone to let her inside. But Anne Miller was never coming home again, and I was the only person in the world who knew exactly how and why she'd died. The Miller family left 3 months after Anne died. I watched from my bedroom window as the moving truck pulled up on a gray December morning, its diesel engine rumbling loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. Mr. Miller came outside first, moving like a man twice his age, his shoulders permanently hunched inward. Mrs. Miller followed, clutching a small box against her chest with both hands, the kind that might hold photographs or jewelry, or other things too precious to trust to professional movers. They didn't look back at the house as they drove away. Not once. Mom had told me they were moving to Portland, where Mrs. Miller's sister lived. She'd heard it from Mrs. Davis, who'd gotten it from someone at the grocery store checkout line. The whole neighborhood seemed to know the details except the Millers themselves, who hadn't spoken to any of us since that morning in September, when Mr. Miller had found Anne's body behind the garden shed. "It's for the best," Mom said when the moving truck disappeared around the corner. "They need a fresh start somewhere that doesn't remind them every day." But the house didn't stay empty of reminders. If anything, leaving it abandoned made everything worse. The first reported sighting came 2 weeks later. Mrs. Chen called the police at 12:15 a.m., insisting she'd seen a young woman sitting on the Miller's front porch steps. When officers arrived 20 minutes later, they found nothing except an empty porch and dead leaves scattered across the lawn. Mrs. Chen met them at the property line, still wearing her bathrobe and slippers, pointing at the exact spot where she'd seen the figure. "She was right there," Mrs. Chen kept saying. "Same clothes as that night, same position, with her knees pulled up like she was cold." The officers took notes and asked gentle questions about Mrs. Chen's medication and sleep schedule. They treated her with the kind of patient kindness usually reserved for confused elderly relatives, but Mrs. Chen wasn't confused. She was 73, sharp as ever, and had lived on this street longer than anyone else. The Martinez family saw something 3 days after that. Mr. Martinez was letting their dog out around midnight when he spotted movement in the Miller's backyard. A figure in what looked like a torn jacket was walking back and forth near the garden shed, moving in slow, deliberate circles. He called for his wife to come look, and they both watched for several minutes before the figure simply faded away, like someone had slowly turned down the brightness on a television screen. "It was her," Mrs. Martinez told my mother over the fence the next morning. "I know it was. Same height, same hair. But her clothes..." She shuddered and pulled her cardigan tighter. "They looked wrong. Stained. Like something terrible had happened." More reports came in over the following weeks. The Pratt family's teenage son claimed he'd seen Anne Miller walking down the sidewalk at 3 a.m., but when he blinked, she was gone. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down swore she'd spotted a pale figure standing in the Miller's living room window, visible through a gap in the boarded-up glass. Even the mail carrier mentioned seeing movement on the property during his early morning rounds, though he admitted it might have been shadows playing tricks on him. The stories grew and evolved each time they were retold. Anne wasn't just appearing randomly anymore. There was a pattern, a ritual that people began to whisper about. If you were brave enough to approach the abandoned house at midnight, knock 3 times on the front door, and call out, "Anne, come outside," she would materialize on the porch steps, always in the same spot where she'd been sitting the night she died. always in the same blood-stained clothes she'd been wearing when they found her body. Most adults dismissed the whole thing as grief-induced hallucinations mixed with teenage imagination. The rational explanation was obvious. People were traumatized by what had happened to Anne, and their minds were filling in the blanks with phantom sightings and wishful thinking. Guilt and shock could make anyone see things that weren't there, but the stories kept coming. James became obsessed with them. Every day at lunch, he'd corner someone new who claimed to have seen Anne's ghost, grilling them for details and writing everything down in a notebook he carried everywhere. He knew the exact time of each sighting, the weather conditions, the phase of the moon. He'd mapped out where people had been standing when they saw her, creating a detailed diagram of the Miller property with X's marking each apparition location. "It's real," he told me one afternoon as we walked home from school. "Too many people have seen her for it to be fake. Mrs. Chen doesn't lie about stuff like this." And the Martinez family? They've never even talked to the police before, let alone made up ghost stories. I kicked at a pile of brown leaves that had blown across the sidewalk. People see what they want to see, or what they're afraid of seeing. But what if they don't? What if she's actually stuck there somehow? The question hung between us as we reached my front yard. Across the street, the Miller house looked like something from a horror movie. Windows boarded up with plywood, paint peeling from the siding, weeds growing tall enough to hide someone crouching in the shadows. The real estate sign in the front yard had developed a permanent lean, and someone had spray-painted "Haunted" across it in red letters before the police made them clean it off. "You live right across from it," James continued. "You could test the whole thing. Just walk over there one night and try it. I'm not knocking on that door." "Why not? If it's all fake like you say, nothing will happen. And if it's real..." He trailed off, probably imagining the bragging rights that would come with being the first person to deliberately summon Anne Miller's ghost. This conversation became a weekly occurrence, then daily. James brought it up every chance he got, wearing me down with persistence and logic. Other kids at school started joining in, daring me to investigate the house that I could see from my bedroom window. The pressure built gradually, like water behind a dam. "You're such a coward," Kevin Marsh said one day when James mentioned the ghost stories during lunch. "You live right there and you won't even check it out." "It's not about being scared," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. "It's about not being stupid. Or maybe you already know something the rest of us don't," Kevin shot back with a smirk that made my stomach clench. "Maybe you saw something that night and you're too chicken to admit it." The accusation hit closer to home than Kevin could have known. I spent the rest of that day wondering if other people suspected I was hiding something. If my reluctance to approach the Miller house was making me look guilty of more than just cowardice. Winter settled over our neighborhood like a heavy blanket, turning the abandoned house into an even more forbidding sight. Snow accumulated in the corners of the boarded windows and formed small drifts against the front door that no one was there to shovel away. The ghost sightings continued, but became less frequent, as if even spirits preferred to stay inside during the coldest months. James's obsession never wavered. If anything, the reduced number of sightings made him more determined to document the phenomenon firsthand. He started carrying his dad's old Polaroid camera, convinced he could capture photographic evidence if he just waited in the right spot at the right time. "Think about it," he said one February afternoon as we trudged through the snow on our way home from school. "We could be the first people to actually prove ghosts exist. Real scientific proof, not just stories from neighbors. Or we could freeze to death standing in someone's yard at midnight. Come on, Daniel. It's one night. A few hours at most. What's the worst that could happen?" I looked across the street at the Miller house, its dark windows like empty eye sockets staring back at me. What was the worst that could happen? I could see Ann Miller's ghost, the girl whose murder I'd witnessed and never reported. I could come face to face with the evidence of my own cowardice, my own failure to help someone who'd needed it. Or worse, I could see nothing at all, confirming that the whole neighborhood had been living a shared delusion, while I alone knew the mundane, terrible truth about how Ann had really died. One night, I said finally, the words coming out before I could stop them. But if nothing happens in an hour, we leave. James grinned so wide I thought his face might split in half. Deal. Tomorrow night. Midnight. I nodded and kept walking, already regretting the decision but knowing I couldn't back out now. The peer pressure had finally worn me down, and tomorrow night I'd have to face whatever was waiting in that abandoned house across the street. The house where Ann Miller had died, and where she supposedly still walked. The walk across the street felt like crossing into another world. My feet crunched through the layer of ice that had formed over yesterday's snow, each step echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. James walked beside me, his breath coming out in short puffs that disappeared almost immediately in the freezing air. He kept his dad's Polaroid camera tucked inside his jacket, one hand pressed against it like he was afraid it might fall out. The Miller house looked even worse up close than it did from my bedroom window. Paint chips littered the ground around the foundation, and the boards covering the windows had warped from months of weather, leaving gaps that made the house look like it was watching us through half-closed eyes. The front porch sagged slightly on the left side, and someone had spray-painted over the realtor's sign so many times that the original text was completely invisible under layers of graffiti. "This is really happening," James whispered, more to himself than to me. I wanted to turn around and walk back home. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave this place alone, to let Ann Miller rest in whatever peace she could find. But Kevin Marsh's words from lunch kept echoing in my head, along with weeks of James wearing me down with his persistence. If I backed out now, I'd never hear the end of it. We stopped at the edge of the front porch, both of us staring up at the wooden steps where Mrs. Chen claimed to have seen Ann sitting. The steps looked exactly the same as they had that September night when I'd watched from my window, except now they were covered with a thin layer of snow that showed no footprints or disturbances. "You sure about this?" I asked, giving James one last chance to change his mind. He nodded, though I could see his hands shaking as he pulled the camera out of his jacket. "We've come this far. Besides, what if we're the first ones to get actual proof? What if we're the ones who solve this whole mystery? What if we're the ones who wake up something that should stay asleep?" I thought, but kept it to myself. James approached the front door with the kind of careful steps you'd use walking on thin ice. The wood looked solid enough, but everything about this house felt fragile, like it might collapse if we breathed too hard. He raised his hand and hesitated for a moment, looking back at me. "Together," he said. "On 3. James, maybe we should... 1. The first knock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. 2. My stomach dropped to somewhere around my knees. 3. The final knock seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, reverberating through the empty house and bouncing back at us from the boarded windows. James stepped back and cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Ann, come outside." Nothing happened. The house stayed dark and silent, and for a moment I thought we were going to stand there all night talking to empty air while our feet went numb from the cold. "Maybe you need to say it louder," I suggested, though part of me hoped he wouldn't. James took a deep breath and tried again, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. "Ann, come outside." The words hung between us like a challenge thrown down to the universe itself. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for some sign that we were either completely crazy or about to witness something that would change everything we thought we knew about the world. That's when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, like a cloud passing over the moon, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door and let all the cold air rush out. My breath started coming out in thick clouds, and I could feel the moisture in my nose beginning to freeze. James grabbed my arm. "Do you feel that?" Before I could answer, she was there. Ann Miller materialized on the porch steps like someone had slowly turned up the brightness on a photograph. One moment the steps were empty except for snow, and the next moment, she was sitting in exactly the same position I remembered from that September night. Knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs. But everything else was wrong. Her clothes hung off her in tatters, torn and stained with dark patches that looked black in the pale streetlight. Her jacket had a long rip down one side, and her jeans were shredded at the knees like she'd been dragged across gravel. The stains covered everything: her shirt, her hands, even her hair, which hung in matted clumps around her face. "Oh my God," James breathed beside me. "It's really her." Anne's head turned toward us with a movement that was too slow, too deliberate. When her face came into view, I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like someone had filled them with ink. Her skin was the color of old paper, and there were dark marks around her throat that I didn't want to think about too closely. She looked exactly like someone who had been murdered. James fumbled with his camera, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. The flash went off with a bright pop that lit up the entire front yard for a split second, and in that moment of harsh white light, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Anne's mouth was moving, not like she was trying to speak, but like she was screaming, her jaw opened impossibly wide. But no sound was coming out, just that horrible silent scream that seemed to go on and on. Then the flash faded, and in the darkness that followed, the sound hit us. It started low, like air being slowly let out of a tire. But it grew louder and higher, until it became a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not just from Anne's throat, but from the house itself, from the ground beneath our feet, from the very air around us. It was the sound of every nightmare I'd ever had, rolled into one piercing wail that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. James dropped his camera. I didn't think about running. My legs just started moving on their own, carrying me away from that porch and that sound and those black eyes that had stared right through me like I was made of glass. Behind me, I could hear James's footsteps pounding across the frozen ground, but I didn't look back to see if he was keeping up. The scream followed us across the street, echoing off the other houses and seeming to chase us all the way to my front door. I hit the steps at full speed, my hand already reaching for the doorknob, when I realized I'd left the door unlocked. Thank God for small miracles. James crashed into me from behind as I yanked the door open, and we both tumbled into the living room in a heap of tangled arms and legs. I kicked the door shut behind us and turned the deadbolt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. We lay there on the carpet, gasping like we'd just run a marathon, our breath still coming out in visible puffs even though we were inside where it was warm. The sound had stopped, but my ears were still ringing from it, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard. I was sure it was going to break something. "Did you see her eyes?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did you see what she was wearing?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I'd seen everything, and it was going to take a long time before I stopped seeing it every time I closed my eyes. I hadn't thought about Ann Miller's ghost in years. The whole thing felt like something that had happened to a different person, Back when I was young enough to believe that knocking on doors could summon the dead, and that teenage dares carried real consequences. Life had moved on in the way life does. College, marriage, career, kids. The house in Seattle that Jennifer and I bought 3 years ago had enough bedrooms for both Sophie and Michael, plus a home office, where I could spread out architectural drawings without worrying about small hands getting into them. Salem was just the place I grew up, and the Miller house was just an abandoned property that someone would eventually tear down or renovate. When people asked about my childhood, I mentioned the good parts: riding bikes to the park, summer barbecues, the neighbor who taught me to throw a curveball. I never mentioned the girl who died across the street, or the night James and I tried to call her ghost back from whatever place the dead go. That was all behind me now. Mom had sounded tired on the phone when she called last month, suggesting I bring the family down for a visit. She'd made the same suggestion every few months for the past 2 years, and I'd found polite ways to decline each time. Work was busy. The kids had activities. Jennifer's mother was coming to town. The usual excuses that adult children make when they've outgrown their childhood bedrooms and moved on to lives their parents can only visit. But something in her voice that day made me say yes. Not to bringing the whole family. Jennifer had a work conference and the kids had school, but to coming down myself for a long weekend. Just me this time, I'd told her. But maybe we can plan something with everyone for Christmas. The drive from Seattle took 4 hours, long enough for me to remember why I didn't make this trip more often. Every mile south brought back memories I'd spent years pushing aside, and by the time I reached the Salem city limits, I felt like I was driving backward through time. Mom's house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood homes always do when you return as an adult. The paint was newer, a soft yellow instead of the white I grew up with. But everything else was exactly the same. The same front porch where I'd sat that September night 15 years ago, watching Ann Miller's empty house across the street. The same bedroom window where I'd witnessed her murder, and then spent years pretending I'd seen nothing at all. The Miller house was still there too, still abandoned, though it looked even worse now. The realtor's sign had long since disappeared, leaving behind only a rusty metal post sticking up from the overgrown front yard. Most of the plywood covering the windows had warped beyond usefulness, and I could see dark gaps where kids or vandals had pulled boards loose over the years. Mom had dinner waiting when I arrived Thursday evening. Pot roast with vegetables, the same meal she'd made for special occasions when I was growing up. We talked about safe topics while we ate. My work, her garden, the new family that had moved in next door, where the Pattersons used to live. She asked about Jennifer and the kids, and I showed her pictures on my phone of Sophie's soccer team and Michael's science fair project. Everything felt normal and comfortable, the way visits home should feel. But by Friday night, I could tell something was wrong. Mom kept looking out the kitchen window while we ate, her eyes drawn to the Miller property, like she couldn't help herself. When I followed her attention, I could see part of the abandoned house through the gap between the oak tree and the fence line. Just a corner of the front porch and the boarded windows, but enough to make me remember things I'd rather forget. "Mom, you okay? You seem distracted." She turned back to her plate, cutting her chicken into pieces that were already small enough. "I'm fine, honey. Just tired. I haven't been sleeping well lately." The phrase hit me harder than it should have. Mom had mentioned having trouble sleeping during several of our phone calls over the past year, but I chalked it up to getting older, maybe drinking too much coffee in the evening. Looking at her now across the dinner table, I could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from weeks or months of interrupted rest. "Have you talked to a doctor about it? There are medications that can help. It's not that kind of problem." She set down her fork and looked out the window again, her eyes finding the Miller house like a compass needle pointing north. Some things just don't let you sleep. The way she said it made my stomach clench. There was something specific in her voice, a weight that suggested she wasn't talking about general anxiety or getting older. She was talking about something particular, something that kept her awake staring at that window. "Mom, what's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. You've been acting strange since I got here." She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes still fixed on something outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never told you what really happened that night." I didn't need to ask which night. There was only one night that mattered between us. Only one event that had changed everything about how we lived in this house and how we related to the neighbors across the street. "Mom, we don't have to." I wasn't asleep. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for 15 years, and they'd finally found a crack to escape through. When Ann was murdered, I wasn't asleep like I told the police. Like I told you. My fork hit my plate with a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet kitchen. "What do you mean?" She turned away from the window to look at me directly, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. I was having one of my bad nights. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't turn my brain off. So I was sitting by my bedroom window, just looking out at the street. You know how I do sometimes when I can't rest. I knew. Growing up, I'd often seen the soft glow of her bedside lamp at 2 or 3 in the morning when I got up to use the bathroom. Mom had always been a light sleeper, prone to waking up in the middle of the night and needing an hour or two to fall back asleep. "I saw her come home," Mom continued, her voice getting steadier as she talked. "Ann, I watched her try the front door and then walk around the house, checking all the windows. I saw her sit down on those porch steps, looking so small and cold." The picture she was painting matched exactly what I'd witnessed from my own bedroom window, but hearing it from her perspective made it feel different somehow. More real, more immediate. And then I saw him. My chest tightened. The man. He came around the side of the house, moving low and careful like he'd done it before, like he'd been watching and waiting. Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against the table to try to stop them. Ann saw him coming. She started to get up, started to scream, but he was too fast. The kitchen felt like it was shrinking around us. I could hear the refrigerator humming and the old house settling, but everything else was completely silent. "I watched him grab her," Mom whispered. "I watched him drag her around the back of the house. I saw the whole thing happen, Daniel. Every second of it." "Why didn't you?" I started to ask, but the question died in my throat when I saw the expression on her face. I was frozen. Tears were running down her cheeks now, and she made no effort to wipe them away. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just sat there at my window watching that poor girl get murdered, and I did nothing to stop it. The confession hung between us like a physical presence in the room. I found myself looking out the window toward the Miller house, trying to imagine what it had been like for her to sit in her bedroom and witness something so horrible happening just across the street. "I could have called the police," she continued, her voice breaking. "I could have screamed loud enough to wake the neighbors. I could have done something, anything, and maybe she'd still be alive. But I was too scared, too shocked to move. By the time my brain started working again, it was too late." I reached across the table and took her hand. It felt cold and fragile, like a bird that had been caught in a storm. "Mom, you couldn't have known. Yes, I could have. She pulled her hand away and stood up abruptly, walking to the window where she could see the Miller property clearly. I saw him coming. I had time to react, but I chose not to, and Ann Miller died because of my cowardice. The guilt in her voice was devastating. It was the kind of self-blame that had clearly been eating at her for 15 years, growing stronger instead of fading with time. That's why I haven't been sleeping, she said without turning around. She knows I was there. She knows I could have saved her. What do you mean? Mom's shoulders sagged like she was carrying something impossibly heavy. I see her, Daniel. I've been seeing her for 15 years. Not in the house across the street like all the neighbors claim. She comes here. To our yard, right outside my bedroom window. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the kitchen. She stands out there in the same torn clothes she was wearing when they found her body, always looking up at my window with that expression on her face. She knows I watched her die and did nothing to help. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, that guilt and insomnia could make anyone see shadows that weren't there. But I remembered my own encounter with Ann's ghost 15 years ago. Remembered those black eyes and that silent scream. If Ann Miller's spirit was still walking around somewhere, it made sense that she'd seek out the one person who could have prevented her death. How often? I asked. Every few weeks at first, then more often. Lately it's been almost every night. Mom turned back to face me, and I could see the exhaustion that went deeper than just missing sleep. She never says anything, never moves, just stands there staring up at my window like she's waiting for me to do something, to acknowledge what I did, or what I didn't do. The weight of her confession was crushing. My mother had been living with this guilt for 15 years, carrying the knowledge that she could have saved Ann Miller's life but chose not to act. And Ann's ghost had been haunting her specifically, not randomly appearing to neighbors, but seeking out the one person who bore responsibility for her death. Why didn't you ever tell me? What was I supposed to say? That I watched a girl get murdered and was too much of a coward to help? That I lied to the police and let her killer get away with it? She laughed bitterly. How do you tell your own son that you're the reason someone died? I thought about my own secret. The fact that I'd also witnessed Ann's murder and had also chosen to stay silent. The irony was almost too much to bear. We'd both been keeping the same terrible secret from each other for 15 years, both carrying guilt that we could have shared. But I wasn't ready to tell her that yet. Right now, she needed to get through her own confession before I could even think about adding to her burden. She was 17 years old, Mom whispered, staring out at the Miller house. Just a kid who made a mistake and got locked out of her own home. And I let her die because I was too afraid to pick up the phone. I stood up and walked over to her, putting my arms around her shoulders. She felt smaller than I remembered, diminished by years of carrying guilt that should have been shared with someone else. You're not responsible for what that man did, I said, though I knew the words wouldn't help much. You didn't kill Ann Miller. But I didn't save her either. And that's almost the same thing. We stood there together at the kitchen window, looking out at the abandoned house where Ann Miller had died 15 years ago, the place where her ghost supposedly still walked, seeking acknowledgement from the one person who could have changed everything, the place where, tomorrow night, I would finally have to confront the truth about what had really happened that September evening when I was 14 years old. I needed air that didn't taste like 15 years of secrets. My mother was still standing at the kitchen window when I pushed back from the table, her shoulders curved inward like she was protecting herself from her own words. The confession hung between us, raw and immediate, and I couldn't sit still with the weight of what she'd just told me. "I need to step outside for a minute," I said. She nodded without turning around. "Take your time, honey. I'm not going anywhere." The night air hit my face like cold water, sharp enough to make me catch my breath. I stood on our front porch for a moment, looking across the street at the Miller house the way I'd done countless times as a kid. The abandoned property looked exactly the same as it had during my teenage investigation with James. Same sagging porch, same warped boards covering the windows, same overgrown yard that made the whole place look like it was being slowly swallowed by weeds and neglect. My feet carried me down the front steps before I'd consciously decided to move. The street was empty, lit only by the scattered pools of yellow light from the street lamps that had been installed sometime after I'd moved away. My footsteps sounded too loud on the asphalt, each one echoing off the quiet houses where people were probably settling in for the night, unaware that their neighbor across the street was finally confronting a truth that had been hidden for 15 years. The Miller property felt different now than it had when I was 15 and stupid enough to believe in ghost stories. The chain link fence that had been installed around the perimeter years ago was rusted and bent in places, but it still stood between me and the house where Anne had died. Someone had cut a hole in the fencing near the front gate, wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were determined enough. I was determined enough. The front yard crunched under my feet, dead grass and fallen leaves compressed into a carpet that hadn't been disturbed in months. Up close, the house looked even more deteriorated than it had from across the street. The front porch steps were rotted through in places, and I had to test each one carefully before putting my full weight on it. The porch itself sagged dangerously on the left side, and I could see gaps between the boards where small animals had probably made homes over the years. This was where Ann Miller had sat that night, knees pulled up to her chest, waiting for her father to unlock the door and let her back inside. This was where she'd been grabbed and dragged away to die behind the garden shed while two different people watched from their bedroom windows and did nothing to help. I stood in the center of the porch, looking out at my mother's house across the street. Her bedroom window was dark now, but I could picture her sitting there 15 years ago, frozen with fear while Anne struggled for her life just a few yards away. The angle was perfect. She would have been able to see everything that happened on this porch, every moment of Anne's terror before she disappeared around the side of the house. "Anne, come outside." The words came out before I'd planned to say them. They hung in the cold air for a moment, then faded into the silence that surrounded the abandoned property. I waited, listening for any response, any sign that something had heard me and was willing to answer. Nothing happened. I tried again, louder this time. "Anne, come outside." Still nothing. No temperature drop. No sudden appearance of a torn and bloodied figure. No horrible screaming that would send me running back across the street. Just the normal sounds of a winter night. Wind through bare tree branches, the distant hum of traffic from the main road, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. The porch steps groaned under my weight as I sat down in the same spot where Anne had waited that September night. The wood was cold and damp through my jeans, and I could feel the winter air finding every gap in my jacket. I pulled my hands into my sleeves and settled in to wait, though I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I found myself thinking about James and his obsession with ghost stories, the way he'd been so certain that Anne's spirit was trapped here somehow, unable to move on because of the violent nature of her death. He'd been wrong about the location, but maybe he'd been right about the trapping part. Maybe Anne had been stuck here all these years, not in this house, but in the guilt and horror of the people who'd witnessed her murder and done nothing to prevent it. The neighborhood sightings made sense now in a way they never had before. Mrs. Chen and the Martinez family, the Pratt kid who claimed to see Anne walking down the sidewalk. They'd all been living with the same collective trauma, the knowledge that something terrible had happened in their community, and they'd been powerless to stop it. Their ghost sightings hadn't been supernatural encounters. They'd been manifestations of shared guilt and grief, projected onto the abandoned house where everyone expected to see something unexplainable. But Anne's real presence, her actual spiritual energy, or whatever remained of her consciousness after death, had been focused somewhere else entirely. Not on this empty house where teenagers came to dare each other into calling her name, but on the bedroom window across the street where my mother sat awake every night, reliving the moment when she could have saved a life and chose not to. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Anne had never been haunting this place at all. She'd been haunting my mother, specifically, deliberately, seeking acknowledgement from the one person who bore responsibility for her death. All these years of neighborhood ghost stories and teenage adventures had been missing the point entirely. The real haunting was happening 50 yards away, behind the yellow walls of the house where I'd grown up. I sat on those rotting porch steps for another 30 minutes, letting the full weight of that understanding settle over me. My mother had been living with Anne's ghost for 15 years, carrying guilt that was eating her alive while the rest of us treated the Miller house like a local curiosity or a dare to be completed. No wonder she hadn't been sleeping. No wonder she looked exhausted and haunted herself. Anne knew exactly who could have prevented her death, and she'd been waiting for my mother to acknowledge that truth. The walk back across the street felt different than the walk over. My legs were stiff from sitting on cold wood, and my mind was racing with the implications of what I'd figured out. The Miller house grew smaller behind me with each step, just another abandoned property that would eventually be torn down or sold to someone who didn't know its history. The real story had never been about that house at all. I found my mother waiting in the kitchen when I came back inside, sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her. She'd made fresh coffee while I was gone, and the smell filled the room with something warm and normal that contrasted sharply with the weight of everything we'd been discussing. "Feel better?" she asked, as I took off my jacket and hung it on the back of my chair. "I think I understand now." I sat down across from her, accepting the mug she offered. "About Anne, about why she's been coming to you specifically." My mother's expression shifted, becoming more alert and focused than it had been all evening. For the first time since I'd arrived for this visit, she looked like she was ready to have a real conversation about what had happened that night 15 years ago. "She knows, doesn't she?" Mom said quietly. "She knows I could have saved her." "Yeah, I think she does." We sat together at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up, finally able to discuss the tragedy that had shaped both our lives in ways we'd never acknowledged before. The confession had changed something fundamental between us, not just because of what my mother had told me, but because we could finally stop pretending that Anne Miller's death hadn't affected our family in profound and lasting ways. My mother began talking about that night in detail, describing every moment from her perspective while I listened, and began to understand the full scope of the guilt she'd been carrying alone all these years.